is to go back and give you some of the background before even this was thought of. All right, if you were around in the in the 1950s and 60s, I was going through the plantings with Rick Ernst of Cooley Farm, of Cooley Garden, which no longer exists. And one of the comments he made, we had gone through that period, we're in the golden years. In other words, people at that time didn't have other things to take their attention. So they grew things like vegetables and flowers. And that was the time of the golden age of, and this is, I'm getting all of this from Rick Ernst, who is the second generation owning Cooley's Farm. And I remember distinctly too, there were big nurseries around. For example, here on 41st Avenue then was just full of things like the begonias of Antonelli's and Verli and Renault and all of those. And then you went on the west side of Santa Cruz and there were 20 acres where they planted not only the begonias, but also the Renault particularly was had the Pacific Coast strain of things, like the delphiniums, which were absolutely gorgeous and tall like this, and primroses was the other thing too that they had. And you could go to nurseries and they grew these out, like Bryant's Nursery. There were 3 different nurseries on Frederick Avenue in Santa Cruz, which ends up at the harbor down there. And they would give you shoe boxes, and you could go put a flag in front of the delphinium you wanted to bring home, and they would either let you dig it up and put it in the shoe box I'm telling you about, or they would have somebody there to do it because they didn't trust you, or whatever it was. And then I remember Bryant's Nursery especially, because it had been just, there were a couple of Okies. They were from Oklahoma. And the husband and wife would always yell at each other. And I was a little kid at that time. I was probably about 7 years old, and I would go with my mother. And they were located now what is the interchange at Morrissey Boulevard and Highway 1 here. And they were taking it over. The state was beginning to build this Highway 1, which we have up here, not SoCal Drive, which was what Highway 1 was at that time. And it was always an entertainment to see them. Well, the state bought their property, and then they got money, and they bought property on what was Frederick Avenue, where they were located at that time. And the flower that was really the hot number in this area particularly were fuchsias. And the Bryants especially had one long, almost 150 feet long of the green, the glass houses, where they had nothing but fuchsias in it. And I was probably young at those days. And I would come sometimes with my mother, and sometimes I would ride my bicycle up there. And I'd go through, there were other nurseries too that had this. There were 3 different nurseries. And one of the things, I was into fuchsias at that time. And as a little kid, I would make sure there was nobody around, and I would snap off a little stalk and stick it in my pant pocket. And I remembered what the name was, and pretty soon I had like 6 of them in my pant pocket, little cuttings. And I'm sure that they probably knew what was going on. But he's a young guy, you know, he's a kid. Leave him alone. And so I brought I had a significant fuchsia collection at that time. I had the climbers, and I had the standard, and all of that. But it wasn't too many years later that they got the Scylla, the bug, the disease, which made all the leaves curl up in the fuchsias, and that killed fuchsias. You really didn't see them around anymore. So that's what it was. And irises were not, they were around, but it was no big deal. The big deal was the ones I was telling you about, and they would grow trees. They had trees in big 20, these big containers of metal that lard came in and stuff like that. Leonard's Nursery, for example, Dominican Hospital? Yeah. Well, that's about a 28-acre piece, which was nothing but nursery there at that time. And there was, they grew a lot of the trees out in the open, and then they would, when they dug them up, they put the sacks around them, and they could sell a 50-foot tree that was planted somewhere. So there were nurseries all over, and people planted, but we didn't have other things to get our attention. We were not, the internet wasn't there. The television was just sort of beginning. And one of the things we had to do in order to get any TV in those days was you put the aerial up about 20 feet, and you had the rotator, so you would try to get the stations in San Francisco, and they came out all snowy and all of that. And that's what we did. And then came along, now I notice they're making a deal of it, 70 years ago, what became the first KSBW TV locally, where you could actually see very well what it was. It wasn't snowed all up like we had before. All right, well, that's sort of what nurseries were too. There were a lot of big nurseries around here for the locals. It wasn't people that we were selling to other people. There were Isley Brothers, if you remember them. See, I'm bringing names I hope some of you remember who were around. And Isley Brothers is now where the Volkswagen dealership is, for example. Further down was the Fredericks Nursery. They had wonderful collections of roses, especially tree roses. And in those, they were all potted up in the 10-gallon container. And then they had a little thing that if you bought it, they could cut it down on the side and pull the container off to the side, and you could pull it up. But they would deliver it to your house. So that you then, because you couldn't put it in your vehicle, and all of that. I don't know how many of you remember this, but I didn't even plan to mention about this, but now I got started, and it was an interesting world we were in at that time. It was something to go to Verly and Renault, where they had the plantings of the begonias, and Antonelli's had a wonderful overdraft thing with the hanging begonias and even fuchsias. And that's the world we lived in. Oh, and Schaefer's had the orchids.
Wow. 41st Avenue.
Yeah.
I went there.
See, she worked there even.
No, I went there in the 60s.
Yeah.
To buy it.
And I mean, we had all those, and Brown Bull.
Brown Bull.
Was the big operation that actually, that's what they did. Now, what is it? It's all part of the Capitola Mall thing. Yeah. That's the world we live in today compared to them. And you don't see people growing much of anything anymore. It's either gone to hell, or they plant something that they don't have to do anything about. I've got a lot of neighbors that have planted, or somebody comes in and cleans it up and then puts a phony palm tree or something. So that's the world we're into. And irises roses, for example, society, I recall, had over 25,000 members at its height. Wow. The society, the National Society. And the iris at that time, also a little in the same time frame, had the American Iris Society had over 8,000 members. And I don't know what they're down to now, but considerably less. How much?
3,500.
Say half the number. And you would, and there were irises, okay, but, so that's the world we were in. And the thing that got me going, I was just at the right age group, I guess, because among other things, I knew all about the roses. I told my mother, then that's the one we gotta buy. We gotta have Madame Henry Goulot. But that's the way you pronounce it, but the one was pronounced as Madame Henry Ghio. And I go, oh, we gotta have a Ghio rose. And anyway, so my grandmother bought one, my mother bought one, and I don't know. And there were 3 roses of Madame Henry Ghio. But at any rate, it was a good time to be around. It was a different world, a different background, and you don't see any of that anymore. The best you see of nurseries now to me is what you see at Kmart. Oh, Kmart's gone too, you don't even see it there anymore. Home Depot, I guess, has some stuff. And they also have different plants now that were existent when this was the height of all of that. So that was it. And it was in that time frame that a lot of new little iris societies were being formed all over the country, but even in this world, in Region 14, which Region 14 technically is made up of Northern California, Nevada, and Hawaii of all places, which iris don't really appreciate. But I found them in Ecuador blooming. But in Ecuador, you're up in 8,000 8,000 feet. Things adjust to that. So, at any rate, there were irises were grown by a lot of different people, and there were a lot of different nurseries around. And one of the things, for example, when I started going to college in I hate to tell you, 1960 to go to San Jose State, we stayed there. I stayed there. But during the bloom season, I commuted as much as possible between San Jose State, where I was living, and Santa Cruz, where I was growing irises. And Mary Ellen Knopf lived on Dry Creek Road, what then was Highway 1, which is now it's Bascom Avenue, if you know the area.
Yes.
All right, then right off of that is where she was. And then the Stewart sisters were one block on 20th Avenue, one block off of whatever the other main drag is there. And I found all these people when I got into the iris, and I guess I already told you the story what got me going into that one in the first place, is because I told my mother, we saw a Flower Grower magazine, and in there was the popularity poll, the 100 most popular iris, but it was put in the context, the 100 most best iris. And I'll go back to that a moment, and I told my mother, well, and I was very careful, I read all that stuff, and I said, this place called Schreiner's Garden is selling, if you take 2 from this list, and 3 from this list, and 2 from this list, you can get them for $7.50. And that would be 3, how would that come out? That's 7. But it would be, most of them would be from this top 10 popularity poll. And I said, well, we should buy them just to see what they really look like. Do they really look like the colors? Because I was accustomed, as she was, the very common, the lavender thing that was blooming around, and Perissima over here, a white one you might find. And over here you might find the purple one, the one blooms all the time that's still around. What is that? Crimson King.
Crimson King.
It grew wild in fields and everything else. Well, I told you the story, and she said, no, I'm not going to buy it, but you can buy it if you want it. Well, I cut my lawns and I got it. And then, of course, the ultimate happened. A few weeks after I ordered, in came a Schreiner catalog, which had all these color pictures in it. And I go, look, it comes with all this other stuff. We gotta have more. and, uh, and ultimately, let's say, I guess I had to buy more. I bought one more group, but then I had the Flower Grower magazine, and I could write a postcard and get like a Coolie magazine, which was also a very fancy magazine. And that got me going also. I said, look, there's more. We didn't get any more, but anyway, that's how this story started. And at that time, I said there were a lot of societies being formed around, not just irises, but other things. The biggest thing in this area, and I mentioned it, was fuchsias. They had what was the Women's Club, is where it was held, the show, the meetings and their show. And where that is now, the Mission Street, and where you turn off to go to Highway 1 to go down, well, that's the Women's Club. It's called something else now, the Harryaki or something or other. So that was going on at that time too. So the question is, how did we form this society, as I got diverted and all these other things? Well, that was going on in a lot of places, as I said, everywhere, but also in this Northern California area. And there had formed societies, as some of you know. The original show I ever went to was held in those days, this is what happened, at the Bank America at, what is the avenue? Lincoln Avenue in Willow Glen?
Yeah.
Okay, there was a Bank America there. And that's where the California State Irish Society met and had a show for Irish. And that's where, at that time, apparently, most of the shows, a lot of things were held in banks. And sometimes it was it was often when the bank, at least Saturday morning, was open, but they let them put their things up. And I went to that, and well, I told you all that story earlier, but the thing about it is what got me caught on it, is I go to the show on Lincoln Avenue, and I told you my father told me I could drive the car there. There was an Oldsmobile Rocket, you know, what was that? What would have been a
Rocket
52? A 50? No, it may be a 62. Yeah, so and I had to drive very carefully over Highway 17, which is not quite as good a shape as this one is now. It's the same road, but it wasn't that way. And I got there, and I was fascinated. I saw they had these Irish displays on the bank counter and all that sort of stuff. It's what they did. And then they you know, and I mentioned this before, and I had read in the 3A magazine, you know, that one. They would, in those you could put they had a thing where clubs could put what events they had coming in the magazine. And one said they would have this show. And that's how I ended up going. And I was sort of interested. And then I saw it was a Sunday, and I mentioned this before, and I saw the best in show was called Voodoo, which was a Klein-Sorgi, brown-ish Irish, because brown was the thing they were really interested in developing at that time. And I was fascinated. Oh, you know, I had some of these Irish. Mine were so much better than theirs. Why are they? Why I can win that show? At any rate, that's how the next year I brought in a handful of them. So we went from there. Now, how did this club get into this? Well, there were two people, and it was Ralph Coleman, who you probably, some of you may remember, but don't. And the other one was, I can't for the life of me remember their exact name, but the wife's name was Joey, Joey, and I could remember that one. And I had just been appointed RVP at that time, and we're talking about 1975. And the thing, and the reason, and I should tell you a little politics behind that. And the problem, the issue became one of the next RVP, Glenn Coleman, Corlew, had been RVP. Now we're talking politics now. And no one, his term was up. It was 3 years like you have now. And his term was up, but there wasn't anybody really willing to take over the position again. And Glenn said, oh, well, I'll do it again. Well, there were enough people involved that didn't want him to do it again. And he was a good friend of mine. We were the three musketeers, Keith Keppel, me, and Glenn Corlew. And in those days, we didn't have the computer and all of this, and you had the round robins where you wrote a letter, and then you responded to it your way, and then you sent it on to the next person, who was usually groups of 10. And there were a lot of people that didn't want him to do it again. And then what occurred is, they said, a person came to me and said, you should become RVP. I said, no, I'm not going to do RVP. I'm going to be, I've already developed my life. I'm going to run for consul this year. On the city council of Santa Cruz. And, well, you can do it. You can do it. Because Elsa Mae Nicholson and I were the editors of the bulletin, the Region 14 bulletin. And I said, well, so we started doing that 3 years earlier from 1975. And I said, I didn't want this common cover on the magazine. If anybody has some, you will note that those 3 years we did the cover of the magazine, Region 14 magazine, differently. We had pictures, we had drawings on it and stuff like that. So that was the end of that period. And when this Corlew, then people began to say, you should become RVP. I said, no, I don't, I told you what I told you. And then people come, no, then I began getting from important people, or friends I knew, like Mary Dunn, calls me and gets in touch, you gotta take it over. Then I get a call from Marilyn Holloway or whoever, you gotta get ahead and do it. Then I get a call from Ben Hager and all of that, so I get all this pressure around me. And I go, well, finally I give in and I say, okay, but Elsie Mae Nicholson has got to be my assistant. But she's got to be doing a lot of the work, because I can't do it all. And that's how I became RVP. And that's how that developed. So that was the political thing behind it.
I don't think it's changed.
Right now it has.
You notice that, huh? So that's, and there were a lot of, like I was going off diverting, one of the first things I ever saw was in one of the early, I know what it was. I saw in the Flower Grower magazine, you could belong to the American Iris Society for $5, I think, as a member in those days. But the thing that fascinated me about the Flower Grower is they would have the 100 most popular iris at that preceding year. And also they would have what iris won the Dykes Medal the preceding year, so it was always a year sort of late. And then I determined, well, you know, if you were a member, you would find out the year before. You had to wait a year to find out what won. And so I broke down and became a member. So I could get the bulletin and find out what won the dice medal, because it fascinated me, because the first one that I ever saw listed was Truly Yours. And the pictures of Truly Yours were pretty fantastic. It was a Fay Iris. It ultimately did get the dice medal. So anyway, you're now getting sucked into the whole process. And then when I show up at Lincoln Avenue for at that point, the California State Iris Society, I asked, because I had read in the 3A, you know, there's supposed to be some garden around here that has iris that you can go see and buy even in person. And it was the Reese iris. And where it is on Willow Avenue, just over the railroad track. There's Willow Avenue, and they explained to me where it was, because I didn't know where it was. I didn't know where I was, other than what I had read. And my father told me, okay. So anyway, that's the involvement, and that's how it all sort of, well, not all, because I'm already doing a lot of the stuff, but now I'm reaching out to meet other people that were doing these things. And in those days, we did a lot of trading. Imagine, I don't know that we do much trading, if any, anymore. Yeah. But the trading was that you had, you know, you trade with somebody else so that you don't have to buy it. You know, you could get that way. That's what we did. And the Stewart sisters were they're two old retired teachers who lived on 20th Avenue. What's this? Herbert Hoover Junior High is the school that was on a block away. Herbert Hoover, imagine that. But they were, you know, they were really into it, and pretty soon they sort of became good friends with me and all that kind of stuff. And the Knopf place was really the one that really did it. They let me, I just happened to go in there because I heard it was there. And the same thing, I went there, and then a time came along, because she had some of the very newest ones, and so did Ruth Reese. But pretty soon then we're talking about something, and I found I could trade my father's fish. He was a commercial fisherman for an iris. And so that's what I began doing. I bring her fish, because the only time I did the community was when in the month that the iris were in bloom, the middle of April to the middle of May. And I would leave off some of my father's fish if he had it as I went on to San Jose State, but I stopped by on the way home to get an anther or something, and she's the one that, for example, had whole cloth when it was first introduced, and she allowed me to get one anther, not anymore, one anther of whole cloth, which I then brought home and carefully crossed it on several different ones. The other one that did that for me also, because they were pretty good to me, were the Stewart sisters, and they had Swan Lake, Mulesteins, a white, which also got the dice medal eventually, which was new at the time, and they also pointed out, finally, if you want, you may have one anther of that bloom right there only, which I gladly did. And so they were also good sisters. They would have a lot of replanting done, and then they had a box where they put the extra ones in, and they'd get all dry up. And I knew if I went in early August, they would let me choose whatever ones I wanted out of that box that nobody else wanted. And that's how I increased my collection as well. So that's enough of that, and this gives you a good how Mr. Ghio got to this point where he is now. It was a good trip, and it was a different trip. It's a different world, and I'm glad I was able to be there, and here I am where I am now, so thank you. All right.
Then we have a Q&A.
Yeah.
How did the club start?
Oh, the club start. I'm sorry, I got diverted. All right, the club started because I started it, and then I got, okay, I was talking about Ralph Coleman and Joe, oh God. The irony of this, I can't remember their name, and it was a weird thing that happened. It had nothing to do with what we're talking about now. My cousin, who was a retired policewoman who was in charge of the 6th Division of the San Francisco Police Department, who was now retired, and,
6th Division.
and would bring some of her friends and close cousins to Reno once a year. On the railroad, they had a thing that, it was a trip. You picked it up in Emeryville, and then you went up to Reno, and then on Sunday, you came back.
Fun train.
Yeah, see, you know.
Yeah.
Oh, you must have been on the trip. At any rate, where was I?
You're on the train.
I'm on the train.
Where your cousin
With your cousin?
Well, no, the one I'm trying to think today, she was on the trip, one of these trips. They had divorced and just accidentally happened to be on the trip. Well, that had nothing to do with what I'm talking about.
But your cousin knows your name.
Well, Ralph Coleman and Joey, the husband, came, and I had now been made RVP, and they feel they needed a support system behind me to help me locally, especially since I was getting into politics at the same time. And so they got together along with a few handful of other people who had interest and began talking about it. And they then formed the Monterey Bay Irish Society. And we met at in those days was not uncommon, at a savings and loan, which had a room that,
Community room.
what was it called? A community room, yeah, that you could use.
Yeah.
And that's where we met. And that's where it officially was formed. Way back in to me, it was that year, 1975. It could be 75, 76 in there. And that's how this club began. And we began with something like, we met at the, after we left whatever the savings loan was, there was an agricultural building, and it's still there on Freedom Boulevard. Right across from there, there's the agricultural offices. And one of the buildings was specifically to help people, they could have meetings there. And that's where our first show was. In that hall in Watsonville, because it was encouraged. And a lot of the groups, I was a member, one of the founding members of Dahlias and Roses. And we used that facility as the original meeting place for the founding, where these societies could begin. Yes?
Who would you say was your mentor, or did you have a mentor in Irish Spring?
Tell me again because my hearing.
Who would you say was your mentor in Iris?
The mentor.
Yeah, for you, when you were young.
The mentor for me was as much me as anybody, probably.
Who's the camel? Who's the camel? Yeah.
A Shriner catalog.
Yeah, the dahlias, for example, were founded by different people, Kay DeVoe, around my kitchen table. Any rate, that's, diversion has nothing to do with what we're talking about. Yeah.
What other clubs were already in the Bay Area? Sydney
Some
B,
of them
probably?
were.
How about, and Clara B, I think.
Okay,
because you
Clara
were
B
president
was
of Clara B for
earlier,
a while.
but the thing goes back to the Stewart sisters and those, because there was this California State Irish Society. And it met, I told you, at one of the savings and loans, in the story above there, it was on 2nd Avenue, I think, in Watsonville. Not Watsonville, San Jose.
Yeah.
And what it was the problem was that people who were really into planting were just a bunch of old ladies. That was the society. They met at 2 o'clock on a weekday and had tea. And talked and gossiped. That was basically what the foundings, what they were doing in those days. And that caused people who were really into the irises to form their own society, which would be concentrated on it. But then there was a political matter of people didn't like people. There was issues there. And for example, the Knopfs, Mary Ellen Knopf in particular, the ones that had founded the Clara B. Reese Society didn't like her. And there was some issue there, which I was staying out of this. I didn't go to any of their meetings. I didn't do any of that stuff. But it turns out then she was involved in forming the Fleur de Lis Irish Society, which was centered more south, or north, I guess, in Campbell area. And that was an issue that went back that people couldn't, then you had ones formed in Mountain View because there was another political can't get along issue stuff. So that was a problem to get over in those days. Eventually those others dried up and disappeared, and we have what was left today, which is Clara B. Reese. That was another thing. It had to do with Ruth Reese, who's the sister of Clara B. Clara B. is older, and she's the one who created snow flurry, which Ruth Reese worked for the San Jose Mercury, who used all of her abilities in the paper to advertise and to push her sister. That she's the one who, you know, the story of Snow Flurry. When it bloomed, Ruth Reese brought a stalk of it to Steinbeck, who was in Berkeley. Remember, there's a lot of irises and world flowers growing all over at this time. And they were very impressed with it and introduced it immediately. I don't know that they had any money of any plants of it, but the matter was to get it out there. And Steinbeck was, and Sidney B. Mitchell, which is the name of a society, lived next to Steinbeck in Berkeley. They were next door to each other. And Sidney B. Mitchell was the head librarian at UC Berkeley. So this is all the stuff that's up here that you're making come out again. So at any rate, that's enough. You're bored now. So let's go on and give away the iris. All right.
Joe.
Keith Keppel lived down here.
No, he's Stockton.
He was was in Stockton and
Yeah,
something?
they work for the post office.
At a future date, I wanna hear you tell about the young Turks of the, like you and Hager